one legal clause, one signature, and their multi-million-dollar deal was dead. Welcome to my new story.
The boardroom sat at the top of the tower like a modern throne room, wrapped in glass and steel, overlooking a city that believed this deal had already been won. Sunlight spilled across the polished table, reflecting confidence, power, and premature celebration. Executives laughed softly, assistants whispered final logistics, and a massive screen displayed projections climbing into 8 figures. The buyer leaned back in his chair, relaxed, already speaking about post-acquisition strategy, as if ownership had quietly transferred before the ink even touched paper. She stood there in a tailored suit, posture perfect, expression neutral, not defensive, not eager. To most of them, she blended into the background, another professional woman invited to witness the moment, not define it. They spoke over her, interrupted her, and summarized her own work as if she were not standing 3 feet away. No one noticed how carefully she listened, how she cataloged every word, every assumption, every careless boast. Inside her leather folder was not just a contract, it was a map of pressure points. Every clause had been read, reread, and cross-referenced. Margins were filled with quiet notes, dates, and legal triggers. One particular section had been underlined so many times the ink was starting to bleed through the page. A clause most people dismissed as standard boilerplate sat there like a loaded weapon, waiting for the right moment. She didn't rush, she didn't interrupt. Predators announced themselves, hunters stay silent. The buyer finally looked at her, his smile sharp and condescending. "Once we sign," he said casually, "this becomes routine." The word routine almost made her smile. She lowered her eyes respectfully, playing the role they had written for her, compliant, replaceable, already outmatched. In that moment, the room relaxed even more. The danger, they believed, had passed. What none of them understood was that power doesn't always sit at the head of the table. Sometimes it stands quietly at the edge, holding the only exit key. She wasn't there to celebrate the deal. She was there to decide when it would end. The shift didn't happen all at once. It started subtly, almost politely. Meetings were rescheduled at the last minute. Emails went unanswered, and numbers that had been agreed upon suddenly came back under review. When she raised questions, they were brushed aside with corporate smiles and vague promises. The buyer spoke to her like someone who had already lost leverage, slow, patronizing, certain she would comply because she had no choice left. Then the pressure became deliberate. Payment timelines were quietly pushed back. Clauses were reinterpreted in ways that favored only one side. In meetings, her voice was interrupted mid-sentence, her concerns summarized by someone else and presented as conclusions already reached. Once, when she pushed back, the buyer leaned forward and said, "Let's not complicate this. The deal is basically done." It wasn't advice. It was a warning. What stung wasn't just the manipulation, it was the disrespect. She had built the asset, carried the risk, and protected the value, yet now she was being treated like an obstacle instead of a partner. The message was clear: sign quietly, accept the changes, and be grateful you're still in the room. They assumed fear would do the work for them. She said very little. She nodded when necessary, asked harmless questions, and took notes no one bothered to read. Inside, something shifted. This was no longer about negotiating better terms or saving face. This was about control, and she realized they believed they already had it. That assumption would become their mistake. The buyer finally crossed the line in a private call. His tone dropped its polish. "You don't have leverage anymore," he said flatly. "Once this closes, your role ends. Fight this and you'll walk away with nothing." She thanked him for the clarity and ended the call without argument. That night, she didn't feel anger. She felt focus. The kind that comes when the rules are clear and the path forward sharpens into a single point. They thought they had cornered her. What they had actually done was confirm exactly where to strike. The night before the signing, the city outside her window moved as if nothing was about to change. Traffic flowed, lights blinked, deals were made and forgotten. Inside her apartment, everything was silent except the soft turning of pages. She sat at the dining table with the contract spread out like a chessboard, legal text highlighted in different colors, tabs marking the sections that mattered and the ones meant to distract. This wasn't panic preparation, this was confirmation. She called her legal team late, not to ask if she could act, but to decide how cleanly it would be done. Material adverse change, she said calmly. The line went quiet for a moment. They knew the clause, everyone did. Almost no one ever used it. Buried deep, written vaguely enough to be ignored, powerful enough to end empires if triggered correctly. She walked them through the timeline, the altered financial disclosures, the casual lies hidden in confident emails. One by one, the pieces locked into place. The buyer had made a critical mistake. He had put the misrepresentation in writing, not once, but repeatedly. Updated figures that contradicted earlier guarantees, statements that assumed no one would compare them. Assumptions built on the belief that she wouldn't push back, or worse, wouldn't understand the implications. He had mistaken her silence for ignorance. Her lawyers didn't argue, they didn't hesitate. "You can terminate," one of them said. "Immediately, no penalties, full protection." The room didn't feel victorious, it felt precise, like a switch being flipped. After the call, she poured herself a cup of coffee and watched the contract one last time. There was no anger in her hands, no shaking, no doubt. She wasn't destroying the deal out of emotion, she was enforcing the rules exactly as they were written. The buyer had relied on intimidation, she relied on the law. She closed the folder, set it neatly by the door, and turned off the lights. Tomorrow the deal wouldn't just collapse, it would do so legally, publicly, and in a way no amount of power or money could reverse. The boardroom felt different the moment she stepped in that morning. The space that had seemed filled with certainty the day before now carried an almost tangible tension, as if the air itself had sensed the storm. Glass walls reflected sunlight, but the brightness did nothing to lift the weight in the room. Executives shuffled papers nervously, assistants hovered uncertainly, and the buyer leaned back in his chair, still trying to radiate control, though the confidence that had dominated yesterday seemed thinner, almost fragile. She didn't rush to sit. She didn't speak yet. Every step she took toward the table was deliberate, measured, like a predator walking into a room of unsuspecting prey. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, the sound cutting through the low hum of office chatter. Then she placed her folder carefully in front of her, neat, organized, almost deceptively calm. One page slid forward, then another. Each one a silent declaration, each one a calculated blow. She had printed out the emails, highlighted every misrepresentation, every misleading statement, every lie the buyer thought had gone unnoticed. Finally, her voice broke the silence, calm, clear, controlled. "Before we proceed," she said, "there's a contractual issue that needs to be addressed." The room froze. Lawyers glanced at each other, pens hovering mid-air. The buyer's practiced smile faltered, then vanished entirely, replaced by a flicker of panic he could not hide. She let the room absorb the weight of what was coming. One of the attorneys picked up a highlighted email, read the dates aloud. Another nodded, confirming the interpretation. The term material adverse change echoed softly but decisively. In that moment, she didn't just hold the power, she embodied it. The deal, which the buyer had assumed was his before the ink dried, was no longer negotiable. It was terminated. Publicly, legally, without penalty, and with undeniable justification. He opened his mouth, tried to negotiate, tried to deflect, tried to salvage even an ounce of his crumbling authority. But there was no opening. Every word he spoke only reinforced his own misstep. She didn't interrupt, didn't argue. The law spoke louder than him, and the evidence was relentless. The humiliation was surgical. Executives looked down, muttered excuses, avoided his gaze. Assistants whispered quietly to one another. The buyer sat frozen, face pale, hands gripping the armrests, realizing that the empire he had assumed was his to command had evaporated in front of witnesses. Witnesses who had once admired him. The press release later would not be dramatic, it wouldn't exaggerate. It simply stated, "Contract terminated due to buyer misrepresentation." Truth, clean and cold, that left no room for spin, no room for redemption. She gathered her documents slowly, each movement deliberate, almost ceremonial. The weight of the room shifted as she left. She had not yelled, she had not raised a finger, but in that room, power had changed sides, quietly, ruthlessly, and forever. The buyer's world had just tilted, and she was the pivot. The morning after the contract was legally terminated, the air in the city seemed sharper, almost electric. Every email, every public filing, every whispered conversation in boardrooms across the skyline carried her signature move. She didn't rush into the next step. She knew patience was the final weapon. One wrong move and the perfection of her plan could crumble. She had already studied the competitor for months, analyzing their appetite, their strategy, their ambition. This wasn't a mere transaction. It was a surgical strike on the heart of arrogance. Her call to the competitor was precise. Calm, deliberate, and measured, she laid out the opportunity with surgical clarity. The same project, the same assets, but with cleaner legal structure, better risk mitigation, and with her own personal guarantee of strategic oversight. The competitor understood immediately that this wasn't just a business move, it was a masterstroke. By the time the conversation ended, a handshake, metaphorical, yet as binding as any signed contract, had been sealed. Within hours, the competitor had confirmed acceptance, and the deal was being formalized. Meanwhile, the buyer sat frozen in his office, watching the public notices and press releases like a man witnessing his own unraveling in real time. Analysts dissected his missteps, clients whispered doubts, and investors began questioning judgment. The very people who had once lauded him for his confidence now watched, incredulous, as he became the cautionary tale of the year. He had underestimated one thing: the quiet one who read every line, understood every clause, and waited for the exact moment to strike. But she didn't stop at humiliation. She ensured the deal she redirected to the competitor was a perfect showcase of her brilliance: higher valuation, smarter protections, and an unshakable edge in the market. The competitor, now thrilled, praised her foresight, while the original buyer could do nothing but watch, powerless as his empire, or what he thought was secure, shifted irreversibly. Her satisfaction wasn't in the money. It was in the orchestration, the way the arrogant fell by the weight of their own hubris, the way silence and patience had crushed ego louder than any confrontation ever could. Every move she had made was deliberate, every word measured, every delay tactical. The deal had been more than just won, it had been weaponized, each piece of it designed to maximize impact, maximize embarrassment, and leave no avenue for redemption. Finally, she leaned back in her chair, overlooking the city skyline from her office, letting the early afternoon sun warm her face. The city didn't know it yet, but a new standard had been set. Revenge wasn't messy. It wasn't loud. It wasn't reactive. It was strategic, meticulous, and unstoppable. She had proven that knowledge, patience, and precision could topple arrogance faster than any army or lawsuit. The buyer, humiliated and exposed, became a ghost of his former reputation, a lesson whispered across the industry. She, on the other hand, became legend. Not for the money she had claimed, but for the clarity of vision, the calculated patience, and the cold efficiency with which she had executed the perfect revenge. The project thrived under new leadership, the competitor flourished, and the world learned: never underestimate the quiet one who knows the rules better than anyone else. And in that moment she smiled subtly, a quiet acknowledgement that true power isn't shown in force or volume, it's shown in control. She hadn't just canceled a deal. She had rewritten the map of influence. She hadn't just humiliated the buyer. She had immortalized the lesson. And the city, the industry, and even the defeated would remember the day the underestimated one became untouchable.